To all of you, thank you for your comments and what you have provided, not only from a historical perspective, but how we might move forward. Mr. Allen, I am intrigued with the what you've outlined for the potential for demonstration projects in rural Alaska. We had an opportunity to kind of describe the situation in many of my communities that are not only not part of a broader grid, they are the very definition of what a true microgrid is. And Mr. Moeller, you mentioned in your testimony that initially, back in the day, we began as basically distributed microgrids, and in many cases, I feel in Alaska, we're going back to the future. We're letting you know what it's like to be that little independent microgrid. But I would welcome you to come to Alaska, to come out to some of our rural communities, and then give us your insight and guidance. I've got an Imagineer at Chena Hot Springs that I think the two of you could share some very interesting ideas about how we might be able to demonstrate at a very small level in our remote and rural communities some of the innovations that are out there. So I would welcome you to that. Great. I want to ask a question to both you, Mr. Moeller, and to you, Mr. Santa, with regards to comments that are made in your written statement. And I'll begin with you first, Mr. Santa, because you make a statement and said, quote, "The U.S. natural gas transmission pipeline industry has been funded entirely with private capital?"
That is correct.
I think that is important to highlight, not only to the committee but to others, but to recognize that not all solutions require federal involvement, federal funding. As we talk about an infrastructure package here, there's no shortage of ideas as to what might go into a broader economy-wide infrastructure package. What it all comes down to is how are we going to pay for it? And so when we understand that, in fairness, what we have seen with some very significant infrastructure has been a level of investment within the industry that demonstrates that given the right investment climate, these projects can proceed. Mr. Moeller, you have also suggested, you made a statement that, again, we don't often see here in testimony before Congress. You said EEI members are not advocating for additional federal funds for transmission investment. And again, I want to highlight that because same situation, not all solutions necessarily require federal funding. So if I can ask the two of you in terms of the necessary investment climate for whether those in the natural gas transmission industry to be able to proceed with projects or your members within EEI to be able to proceed to projects, what is it that can and should be done to ensure that we have that necessary investment climate to allow for these particular investments?
I would begin by saying I think what the investors in pipelines need and the investors more broadly in energy infrastructure is certainty and predictability. In my testimony, I talked about the Natural Gas Act framework and how favorable that has been to encouraging private investment to develop the infrastructure to support this industry. What we have now, though, is, and I noted there are multiple other permits that are required. That permitting process, I think, can be coordinated more without violating the purposes of many of those statutes that are intended to protect the environment and various resources. So I would encourage, as a complement to whatever may be done on publicly funded infrastructure in a bill, to also look with an eye toward what can be done to improve permitting for infrastructure.
So permitting, certainty, coordination. Mr. Moeller?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The written statement that I have elaborates more on this, but similarly to what Mr. Santa said, citing and permitting reform and certainty and accountability, along with the emphasis on cooperative federalism so that one state doesn't deny the benefits to the citizens and customers of many other states, and infrastructure that really is affecting interstate commerce is important. Specific to the investment climate at FERC, there are some good challenges FERC has based on a period of interesting monetary policy, where the formula that was come up with that was rejected by the courts are frankly not putting the commensurate return given the risk of transmission investments. The Commission has to deal with this. We've got a white paper out that's trying to help them on that, and I'll happily give you copies of it. In addition, there's serial complaints, the 15-month issue I mentioned. There's the capping of transmission incentives, which I think is probably counter to the intent of Congress from the 2005 Act. And then the ongoing very general issue of cost allocation on these multi-decade assets, where figuring out who pays how much, there's a lot of art and science in that because flows change over the decades, but adding more certainty very generally to that will improve the investment climate.
Very good. Thank you both. Senator